Greetings. I'm going to carry on now with Chapter 3 of Search for a Nonviolent Future. And in Chapter 3, we really get into the science of nonviolence. Chapters 1 and 2 were more or less preliminary. Where does the word come from? What are we talking about? How to think about it? What some obvious mistakes to avoid. And with Chapter 3, we actually get into some cases and start analyzing how nonviolence works. And we start this at the ground level. There are different schools of approach to nonviolence, and whatever you call the school of approach that we're coming from, principled nonviolence or spiritually based nonviolence or radical nonviolence, as some people have called it, or simply what Gandhi called nonviolence of the brave, as opposed to merely going through the motions. Whatever you call it, this is the school of nonviolence which regards it as coming from within the person, that the primary change has to be there. And so we need to understand various dimensions of that change, and of course we're going to get into how to bring it about. And one very arresting example is this Birmingham episode in Birmingham during the civil rights movement in the US is on page 64. And the conclusion that I draw from it is, okay, we have in the old paradigm, the old way of thinking about force and power, there was this slogan, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. But as I say, in this episode that took place in Birmingham, the police and the firemen had all the guns, but the people, the marchers, apparently had all the power. So that makes it very clear that there's a different kind of power that human beings have access to, that it does not require equipment, and that in the right circumstances, we'll talk a great deal about what those circumstances are. In the right circumstances, this kind of power can be made to prevail very reliably over threat power and the weaponry of death. So then I deal with the point that even mass movements, if they're going to be really nonviolent, have to be individual movements in the sense that the mass in question is going to be made up of individuals who are going through the kind of change that we're talking about. So there is a beautiful statement by an important commentator on the people power movement in the Philippines. Almost 2 million people were mobilized, but he said every single individual had made the decision to go out, and they had gone out. And this is very much Gandhi's style. He always insisted that everybody who was going to be part of a movement, whether they were alone or whether they were part of a mass crowd, they had to go through that transformation themselves. It was not a question of just rousing numbers for the sake of numbers, because that would never have much of a lasting effect. So we talk here about kind of two stages in developing a nonviolent response within us. The first is a question of attitude, and there it seemed to me, and it still seems to me, that the key to developing a nonviolent attitude is not to see the issue primarily about yourself. It's not just about you. There is a principle involved that you are representing, and whether you succeed or fail, whether you win or lose, is not the whole point. So we have this marvelous quote from someone who was very badly beaten during the freedom rides, and he said, "You feel the pain, but you don't get bitter because you were doing this for something larger than yourself." Now that's going to be a theme that will come up again and again throughout these personal testimonia that we're going to hear from people who have done nonviolence. So that's what you might call the first level of getting nonviolent, which I call outer work, though it's a question of our mental attitude. It's a question of seeing that this isn't about us, and especially it's a question of seeing our connectedness with other people. But there's an even deeper kind of technology that we can apply, and that's meditation. So from pages 77 on, I talk about how the practice of meditation is relevant to generating nonviolent power within us. So in a certain way, you could say this really is the core message of the whole book, though this is not to say that unless you have a daily meditation practice behind you, you won't be able to be nonviolent. No, you can go a good part of the way. But if you really want to make it part of your life and you want to be able to call upon it whenever it's needed, you do need some kind of inner spiritual practice which is going to calm down and quieten the mind, because it's that activity of the mind that makes us focus on ourselves and our personal stake in everything. And the chapter closes with a marvelous quote from Gandhi, where he says, this struggle that he goes through to control his anger, and notice it's not like he does not have any anger. You know, he said that I can make a satyagrahi out of a violent person, I cannot make a satyagrahi out of a coward. We should not feel bad about having these negative drives, which are classically anger, fear, and greed. If we didn't have those negative drives, and this goes all the way back to the David's experiment in the very beginning of the book. If we didn't have those negative drives, we wouldn't have the raw material for nonviolence. A lot of people get nervous when we talk about principled nonviolence or inner nonviolence because they think we're saying you have to be a saint before you can practice it. But that's not at all the case. You just have to have the desire to not identify yourself with your negative drives and not let them push you around. So Gandhi's very humble testimony is that he goes through the struggle his whole life, and it gives him a sense of the meaning of life and the purpose of nature, which are really quite remarkable statements, and it gives him a joy which he says he has no power to describe. So while nonviolence requires a lot of work, and while there is risk involved, and while there is not a guarantee of success, what the picture that's starting to emerge from this chapter, and we'll build on it a couple of times more, is that this is an extremely healthy thing for a human being to do. We're going to go on to say that it is actually the most healthy thing for a human being to do, and it actually is our purpose in life to find our way to do this. Recently, I had the privilege of speaking about nonviolence at a mosque in Michigan, and I talked about the story, this traditional story about the Prophet Muhammad, that they were coming back from a successful battle, and one of the Prophet's disciples said, well, now we have carried out a successful jihad, we can celebrate this. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said that was the lesser jihad, meaning the jihad of outer struggle against others. Now we have to take up the greater jihad, which is the inner struggle against everything that's negative and inhibiting in ourselves. And so I suggested to the Muslim friends of ours that nonviolence is the greatest jihad. It is the basic struggle that all human beings have to be involved in for their own spiritual health, as well as for the reformation of everything that's going wrong in our culture and our society. So that's chapter 3. Good luck with it.